Creating and capturing value. We've seen that innovation's a journey which involves translating an idea into something that creates value. But if we get to the end of that journey, we've probably got to ask ourselves three important questions. First of all, can we create it? From the idea to the launch, and most importantly, have we built a business model that will underpin and define how we're going to create that value? And can we revisit that model to check whether we were able to create the value? But there's a second point here. Can we scale it? And this raises the whole set of questions around adoption and diffusion of innovation. And the third question, can we sustain it? Not only capturing the value that we've created, but also protecting it, growing from the initial idea, building something more from our innovation. Now these are three important questions, and we're going to look at the outline of these in this film. So, the first question, can we create value? Well, the idea of a business model is very powerful here. We've already seen that a business model provides a roadmap, a framework for thinking about how we create value. Innovation doesn't just happen, it's a process, and it involves thinking about a number of things. In particular, looking backwards and looking forwards, have we got a mechanism for identifying the value we want to create, identifying who we want to create it for, and identifying how we're going to do that? So do we, or have we, realized the value proposition as we get to the end of the journey? Is it something that our target market will actually find of value? And we have to think very hard about balancing all the costs, all the things we put in to create our value proposition, to create our innovation, and making sure we have enough revenue coming in to balance that. And is this a viable model? Were we lucky, or is this a model that actually is strong, and importantly, is it sustainable? Will it be resilient into the future? So looking again at our business model provides us a pretty helpful checklist for making sure we really have created value. But our second question is around adoption and diffusion. And innovation, if we think about it, doesn't bing, miraculously happen, nor does it instantly spread from one person adopting it to many. What we actually have is a classic S-curve shape. Over time, first of all, a few people adopt the idea, and then a lot of people do, you get the acceleration, and finally, near the end, we just have a few diehards who are very slow to adopt. But whatever kind of innovation we talk about, it diffuses over time in an S-curve. So we'd be very interested in understanding what affects the shape of that curve. How do we get people to adopt things more quickly, and how do we get more of them to adopt? And this whole field of what's called diffusion theory is an area that a man called Everett Rogers spent his life looking at. His very famous book in multiple editions was called The Diffusion of Innovations. And he basically had a model which saw adoption as a communication process. A process of moving from a source to somebody receiving an idea and taking it on board. So very much a communication model. And very helpfully, Rogers identified 4 sets of characteristics which influence that process of adoption. First of all, the characteristics associated with the innovation itself. Things like the relative advantage. How much better is it than the thing it's going to replace? The complexity. How hard is the new thing to understand? The observability, the seeing is believing effect. The trialability. Can we test this out before we do something with it? And most importantly, compatibility. Does it fit with our world? Now these are all important questions to think about, which will affect the speed and the rate and the extent of diffusion. But we also need to think about who is offering this, the perceived characteristics of the innovator. A third set of characteristics have to do with the adopter, the person taking on board the new idea. And once again, this is not something that everybody's the same with. There's basically a distribution across the population. Some people are very keen to try new ideas very quickly. Others take a lot longer before they actually will take something new on board. That's what gives rise to some of this S-curve effect. So it's helpful for us to try and understand what are the key characteristics of adopters, and particularly what are the characteristics of early adopters. And finally, in Rogers' model, there are a set of influential things in the environment, the context in which all of this adoption decision is taking place. But what we basically have with Rogers' model is a helpful framework for thinking about innovation diffusion. But there are some key points we should remember in this model and in the idea of innovation diffusion. The first and hugely important one is it's all about perception. Adoption is in the eye of the beholder. Just because something is apparently the best thing since sliced bread doesn't mean it will diffuse unless people perceive it to be so. So it's very much about perceptions of the innovation and of the person or the organization trying to introduce the innovation to us. The second thing is that we can work with the knowledge in the Rogers kind of model to influence and to shape the process of diffusion. We can play with the message and how that's communicated, very much what advertising does in trying to persuade us to take on new things in our lives. We can use different channels. We can provide opportunities for people to try things out. There are many different things we can use based on our understanding of adoption to help accelerate the process. We also have to remember that it's not one thing which is transferred to others. Innovation is constantly evolving. As the early people adopt it, so there is feedback, and that helps shape the later generations of the innovation. So it's a process that changes over time. And very importantly, diffusion of innovation is a social process, that individuals can influence others. The key role there is of intermediaries, sometimes called opinion leaders, but basically the people whose opinion we respect, and if they make a decision to adopt something, we may well decide to follow them. So there's a great deal in this field of innovation, adoption and diffusion, which will help us understand how best we might create value and capture it by scaling our innovation. And the third key question is around capturing and protecting the value. Our innovation is great, but can we hold on to the value that we've created? Innovation basically invites imitation. If somebody comes up with a great new thing, other people will say, that's interesting, we'll try and do that as well. And so all the time this process of imitation is driving innovation further and further forward. What it means is, for the initial innovator, there's a big question around protecting and capturing the value that they've worked so hard to create. And there are lots of different mechanisms which might be available to help protect our valuable idea. It could be things like patents, which basically provide a legal framework which means that other people are not allowed to copy our ideas. Or copyright, as the name suggests, again, protecting in some way. Sometimes there's protection if we know something, but it isn't written down, what's called tacit knowledge. And in all sorts of other ways, there are mechanisms we can use to help keep our knowledge to ourselves or protect it from others imitating and capturing the value for themselves. And there's another important concept here, the idea of what are called complementary assets. What else do you need to ensure that value is created, and how far can you control these things? We talked in the business model of all the different networks we might need to reach our marketplace and all the things we might need to do to create our value proposition in the first place. These very much involve different kinds of complementary assets, and the more they are under our control, the more likely it is we're going to be able to protect our innovation. And there's a concept, another useful concept, around what are called the appropriability regime. How far, how easy is it for somebody else to march in and imitate our idea? A strong appropriability regime means there are a lot of defenses. A weak one means that many people could copy our idea. The last thought is around sustaining value creation and value capture. What are the growth pathways? What's the next step in our innovation process? And in particular, this is where the idea of building platforms and innovation ecosystems, mobilizing the complementary assets to leverage and strengthen our protection, to continue to create and capture value from our idea. Business models are very helpful here. remember they're a framework for identifying value creation, but also where and how we might capture and protect that. Think about the case, for example, of the Apple iPod. Now, this was building on the possibilities opened up by the invention of the MP3 player. The idea that we could carry music coded in software and use that to carry representations of music so we can have portable music. We no longer needed CD players or gramophone players. We could have the thing on a very small handheld device. And Apple were extremely successful. But they weren't the first inventors of the MP3 player. What Apple did was not only to create a valuable resource, a beautiful design in the product itself, but also to create a bigger ecosystem. What Apple did very well was to work with the question of complementary assets to make sure that legally it was possible to share music, mechanisms for Apple to get revenue through people purchasing small amounts, buying one track at a time, licensing deals, royalties, all sorts of things in a wider ecosystem. That, of course, is now challenged by the streaming services like Spotify. But again, Spotify is not simply a single product or a single idea. It's essentially trying to create a platform across which many other things can happen. So let's try and summarize where we've been in this short film. Innovation, as we've said all along, is about creating value from ideas. But that doesn't just happen. And very importantly, we need to make sure that we can create value and capture and sustain it. And it raises three important questions. First of all, have we been able to create the value, to move from idea to actually making it happen? And do we have a visible, viable business model which explains and thinks through how that value is captured? Can we also scale our innovation? Can we work with the principles around adoption and diffusion to make sure it's not just creating value for one or a small number of people, but can actually spread and grow? And can we sustain this? Can we capture and protect the value? And can we move to the next stage to build a platform or an ecosystem?